All right. Hey, everybody. Give you a second to filter in. We got a big group today. All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome to our January Central Carolina Area Agency on Aging webinar. Today, a really exciting and timely webinar. We're going to have federal and state policy updates. If you haven't been with us before and you're not familiar with the Zoom webinar mode, everybody is automatically muted. You're not able to see our participants, but you can see speakers and hosts. And if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat box. I know Bob and Mary are going to be answering questions after they're done speaking. We are recorded today, and we will post this on our website. So if you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with your colleagues, it will be there and available for you. I'm going to turn things over to Linda, and she is going to introduce our speakers for the day.
First, I want to thank you all for being here. I know that it's a really busy time and a lot's happening, and so this couldn't be more timely, and we do have a great crowd, so we appreciate it. I'm going to introduce both Mary Bethel and Bob Blancato right now, but we're going to have Bob go first and do the national perspective and get him out of here. As you can imagine, up there in Washington, D.C., things are really hectic, and we want to make sure that Bob gets to do what he wants to do. So Mary Bethel, and I've known both of these people for probably 20 years, probably more Mary, because she was at the division when I started. So Mary Bethel is the chair of the North Carolina Coalition on Aging. She's, as I mentioned, she is retired from both AARP as Associate State Director for Advocacy. She worked at the Division of Aging or Division of Aging and Adult Services for many, many years. Very instrumental in helping the senior Tar Heels and getting them off the ground and making sure that they get support from the state when she was there. She has a really strong background in advocacy. She is on the Governor's Advisory Council on Aging. And right now she, as if she didn't have enough to do, she's also the co-chair for the Multi-Sector Plan on Aging, which is all stages, all ages, all stages. So I'm sure many of you have heard about that. So thanks, Mary. If you hang tight, we'll get you second. Bob Blancato is a good friend. I've known Bob for many years and served on the NANAS board for more years than I should have, 9 years, I believe. Bob's the executive director of NANAS, and he is also the president of Matt's Blancato Association, NANAS. Their slogan is National Voice, Local Action. If you aren't members, and that's just not for nutrition providers, it's for any aging services, really take a look on their website and become a member, because the advocacy that they do really, really helps all of us and is a great forum to also learn what's happening. Bob's also instrumental in the Elder Justice Coalition. So we're going to let Bob go first. We're also going to change the format a little and let him take questions right after that. So I'll turn it over to Bob and Caitlin to go ahead and get us started.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Linda. And Caitlin, thank you very much. Before we get started, let me just make a couple of comments about my colleagues on this webinar. First of all, all the things that you talked about Mary, I think I've known pretty much all her roles. Mary is a very unique individual as a state leader in aging as advocacy. She has seen it all, done it all, and done it all well. And it's a pleasure to see her still involved. And I'm particularly glad to see you involved in the multi-sector plan on aging, which I think is really a significant statement on the part of now over 30 states who are doing plans like this to help get the federal government to finally produce a national plan on aging, which I think has been long overdue. So, Mary, congratulations on your latest endeavor, and it's great to be on the same webinar with you. And Linda Miller, well, Linda's a local legend, but, at the same time has a lot of national credentials. She was not just on the board of NANA, she was the chair of our board. And in the course of doing that work, she really enhanced our advocacy activities, our impact, with all the challenges that we had at different points during her time as chair, and did it with the usual style and grace that comes with Linda automatically. She also serves on the U.S. Aging Board and has played a major role there as well. So, Linda, it's a pleasure to be with you today as well. So, let's go on, Caitlin, to the first slide if we could. So, I decided we better start with the most recent news, the topic that had everybody in a state of absolute confusion, concern yesterday. You know, on Monday night, it was announced that a freeze on federal grants and loans was going to start yesterday at 5 p.m. Well, just before 5 yesterday, a federal judge halted that freeze until February 3rd, when a hearing will be held to discuss both the merits and the legality of the OMB order from Monday. Now, as you probably had read and heard and talked to local officials, the freeze order would have suspended funding for thousands, tens of thousands really, of federal programs. Direct payments to people on Social Security and Medicare and SNAP were exempt. But, and it's also important to realize, again, not a lot of information, but we did discover in the course of the day was that funds that were already dispersed, okay, were not supposed to be affected by this freeze. The programs that were seeking to draw down funds, as is often the case, you know, you don't get your money all at one lump sum. It can be spread out over a couple of months. You may draw down every quarter, whatever it may be. That's where the freeze would have taken effect. And based on the charts that the Office of Management and Budget put out, older Americans Act programs could have been impacted. Now, there was some confusion about that. ACL indicated they didn't believe that OAA programs were going to be impacted yet. The OMB chart suggested otherwise. And there was even someone who said yesterday from OMB that they felt that in the area of nutrition that they felt it should not be affected. That is not an assurance in my book. Either you are or you're not, okay? Not should not be affected is not the way to answer a question of an issue that important. So to say the least, the full extent of this order was not entirely clear. It has not been and is still not as we wait for Monday. Next slide. So our recommendation to the folks on this webinar and everywhere else is we need to act as if this freeze could come back or some version of it could come back. And while we wait to see, we need to respond with our strongest advocacy tool that we have, which is data and the stories of the older adults that we serve. Okay. So things like what would a pause in your funding mean in real terms, whether it's a day, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it may be. How many older adults could be impacted in your programs, especially those who are receiving congregate and home delivered meals? And for that group, how many of those people is that their only meal of the day? And we also need to know, and we had a separate question on this from that last week, but we want to do it again this week. Do you use funds from the social services block grant to provide meals? Because you can get home delivered meals through that SSBG program. All this information we need to have to be ready to share so we can use it in our communications with elected officials in Congress and also the media. The media is very interested in talking about this subject. And we're going to be, NANAS will be continuing to monitor the situation very closely, and we're going to propose and put out all updates as they come available, which is another reason to follow Linda's advice. If you're not a NANAS member, this is a great time to join because this is the way you can get our information that comes out pretty regularly, and on occasions like this, it can come out several times in one day. So that's what we know at the moment about the activities from yesterday. So let me move on to some other things that are here and now, so to speak. Okay, some of the major changes of, starting this year with Republicans now control the White House, the Senate, and the House, as we all know. It's been 26 days since the start of the 119th Congress. We have a new majority leader, Senator Thune of South Dakota, and let me just say that his appointment may be one of the more important ones that have been made, because as we're discovering in the first 9 days of the administration, we may be needing some backstops in the Senate and the House to push back on some of the initiatives that may come out of the administration. And I think Senator Thune is in that role. He respects the Senate. He recognizes their importance in the separation of powers in our country. With the House Speaker is returning as Mike Johnson from Louisiana. And we have 77 new members in Congress of the House and the Senate, including 5 in your own state. And one thing I will suggest to you, and we're going to be providing this as time goes on, it's important to know what committees your members are on, because in your case, all your members are in the majority since the House is run by the Republicans. And so we want to see which ones are, for example, are on the Education and Workforce Committee, which does the Older Americans Act, which ones are on the Ways and Means Committee, which does Medicare and Social Security, which ones are on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which does Medicaid. So if you're represented by any of these folks, spend some time, communicate with them, introduce yourself, and also inquire from them on what their committees are, and just develop a relationship early. And if they're all new, that makes it even more important to get them early in terms of the education part of it. Next slide. In your delegation also, there was a big move made by Congresswoman Fox, who was the chair of the committee that produces the Older Americans Act. She stepped down as chair of the Education and Workforce Committee. And in the area of elder justice and elder abuse prevention, Senator Tillis serves on an important chair of a subcommittee on financial institutions and consumer protections, which what that means, that's a lot of words, but what that really is about is there's going to be a great new focus, as there should be, about the proliferation of scams against older adults in this country. It's amazing how they grow and how they grow from all directions. You know, we had a contact on our Elder Justice Coalition just after the election from a big crypto firm who said, you know, we're beginning to see the issue of crypto scams going on, and we want to help you guys address these issues. And Senator Tillis' subcommittee is going to be one of those entities that will be looking at that. And Senator Budd is also on a relevant committee that will be addressing some of the issues around elder abuse and prevention. Next slide. So let me talk about key chairs and committee people so we can just put this in context. All right. Well, we talked about Senator Thune, and Senator Schumer remains the top Democrat in the Senate. But when we get to the Health Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and by the way, just as an aside, when we get down to the Finance Committee, I'll just make a comment. But on Health Committee, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana is a new chair. He was the ranking member before, and Senator Sanders now flips and becomes the ranking member. Senator Cassidy was one of the 8 senators who worked to produce the Older Americans Act that almost passed last year, which I'll talk about later. And we're already in conversation with him about how to move the Older Americans Act as quickly as possible in this new Congress. Appropriations Committee, those are the ones that cover all the funding issues. The chair is Susan Collins from Maine, who is a longtime advocate for older adults. She chaired the Senate Special Committee on Aging for a number of years. She comes from a state that has an average median age, which is like in the top 3 in the country. Senator Patty Murray, who was the chair, is now the ranking member. And these are 2 of the most effective legislators in the Senate. And so it's something to feel good about. The Senate Finance Committee, which is a big, big committee covering Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and elder justice. They have a new chair, Senator Crapo from Idaho, and Congressman Senator Wyden is the ranking member. And today, if you're in the mood for must-see TV, the confirmation hearings for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. begin today in the Finance Committee, and it is expected to be quite a show. So those who have time to, slip away a little bit and go to your TV or your whatever your device is, you might want to watch this and see how this turns out. And then finally, on the Special Committee on Aging in the Senate, Senator Rick Scott of Florida is the new chair, and Senator Gillibrand from New York, a great advocate for the Older Americans Act, is its top Democrat. Now, on the House side, as I mentioned, Congresswoman Fox left as chair of the Education and Workforce Committee and is replaced by Congressman Tim Walberg from Michigan. Many of us have no real history with this gentleman, but we're in contact with him to introduce him to the Older Americans Act and its importance. Congressman Bobby Scott is a longtime advocate for the Older Americans Act and remains top Democrat. There's a new chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Congressman Guthrie from Kentucky. And it's important to realize that one of the reasons why that judge yesterday came down with that decision to postpone or delay this freeze was because of the confusion around Medicaid and what it was going to do to Medicaid. And states that were out there trying to get information or even draw down some funding found that the portal that they would need to do that was frozen because of overload. And I think when a lot of governors started weighing in and started talking about the impact of this freeze, Medicaid was the driving force, I think, in what led to this action by the judge. Okay, next slide. So for those of you who are following the whole process of this new administration, this is not Trump's second term. This is Trump 2.0. He came ready to work. Just look at how quickly he nominated his cabinet and sub-cabinet positions. He named the first female chief of staff in American history. And I noticed yesterday he also named the first female press secretary in a number of years. And as I mentioned, confirmation hearings have begun. The R. F. Kennedy one is happening today and tomorrow. But only the Senate Finance Committee actually votes whether he gets confirmed or not. And I guarantee you it's going to be a very, very close call as to whether he gets confirmed. And then we wrote these slides a couple of days ago, and some of these things I may have to update, but the director of OMB is up for a vote for confirmation on Thursday. But because of the fact that that memorandum came out from OMB on Monday, freezing funding, there are some in the Senate that want to hold his vote up until they establish what this memorandum really means. So his confirmation is not automatic at this point. Next slide. So we have other people who are waiting in the wings to be approved for their new jobs. Many of you know of Dr. Oz from his TV days. He's been nominated to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a hugely important position. Former Congressman Weldon from Florida has been nominated to be the administrator of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We have not heard anything yet on who might be tapped to run the Administration for Community Living and the Administration for Aging. So in the meantime, all these agencies and sub-agencies have acting heads who are going to work and still doing work. And President Trump has already named more than 40 people from his first administration to jobs in his second administration. So let's go to, and they may have to update this a little bit because I've done a lot of presentations in the last couple of weeks. So the National Journal, which is a big, well-read Inside the Beltway publication, said the priorities that they saw a few weeks ago for the president were tax cuts, immigration focused on securing the border, energy and climate, more drilling and less regulations, slowing our aid to Ukraine down, and the imposition of tariffs on a range of products, particularly from Canada and Mexico. Now, the train wrecks, in my judgment, that the administration will be confronting is, number one, the debt ceiling. Now, you've heard about this thing. This is when we reach a point where if we cannot lift that debt ceiling, the United States of America would default on its loans and its commitments and obligations, which is something which has never happened, and nobody ever wants to see it happen. But to keep it from happening, you have to lift the debt ceiling for a period of time. And the question is, how do you do it and where do you do it? And the way the new Congress and the president are working, there are going to be a limited number of bills that come up in the beginning of this session of Congress. And the debt ceiling could be attached to those bills that come up. That could include a tax bill. And how big is the tax bill and what are the offsets going to be to pay for it? What are the impact of tariffs going to be on prices in the United States? There have been articles written about if you impose a 25% tariff on this, your car prices could go up, other things can go up. This at a time when a president was elected on lowering inflation, lowering the cost of living. So that's got to be factored into it. What are we going to do about the rest of this fiscal year and funding? And then finally, confirmations. There are some out there that are not going to make it, in my judgment, and that could be problematic for the administration. So next slide, where does Congress start? Okay, well, we talked about the Senate. They're in the midst of doing confirmation hearings. But here's where it gets to be more dicey and more complicated. Now you have the return of what they call budget reconciliation, which is a process by which you only need 51 votes instead of 60 to pass key bills in the Senate. And remember, the Senate is controlled by the Republicans 53 to 47. So the argument going on right now between Republicans now, not between Democrats, this is all between the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans. Are we going to do one bill or are we going to do two bills? Okay. Is it going to be first a bill on border security and energy, or are we going to have it rolled in with tax reform? All right, and there's a difference of opinion between the House and the Senate on what to do. We're focused on what cuts to programs could be applied to offset the cost of a tax bill and tax reform bill that I mentioned. One of the things that's been talked about, and one of the things we should keep a very close eye on, is eliminating all funding for social services block grant. Now, SSBG, for those of you who follow it, and I'm sure many of you do, it provides some funding for states to use for home delivered meals, but more importantly, both child and adult protective services are funded under SSBG. And APS is the front line in our efforts to combat elder abuse. So if you take all the funding away from SSBG, you lose money for home delivered meals and adult protective services. So is this all going to be rolled into one bill, which makes the process longer? The House would prefer one bill. The president wants early wins, but he won't weigh in on what he prefers, either one bill or two bills. And of course, where's that debt ceiling I talked about play into all this? So we're going to see. And it's going to be known, we're going to start to see real trends and indications within the next 2 weeks on what's going to happen. So leftover items from last Congress. First of all, funding for the rest of this fiscal year. Okay, we know from our long history of dealing with federal funding that when you get to be October 1st, when the fiscal years begin, Congress has never finished its work, and they're stuck having to pass what they call a continuing resolution, which means that you are funded at current levels through a date certain. The first date was December 21st. Then Congress, as they left town, and the previous Congress left town, they passed a bill to allow funding to continue at FY24 levels through March 14th. But that's going to be sooner than you think, March 14th. So what do you do after that? Or maybe before that? You could do a third continuing resolution, maybe go until April or May. You could pass individual funding bills for like HHS, Health and Human Services, and labor and transportation and so on. And right now it's unclear what is going to happen. And one thing that may happen is they could end up with a year-long continuing resolution. And it might be the best option because it does not cut funding. But unfortunately, it doesn't increase funding either. So this is one of those that we don't have the answer to yet, but we're monitoring very closely. And again, if you stay in touch with NANAS, you'll get updates as things develop. Now, this one I know is a lot of people are concerned about this, and I am as well. It was at the very least unfortunate that the Older Americans Act could not be finished last year when it was supposed to be. And I'll make it very, very clear. The Senate did their part. They produced a bipartisan bill involving 8 senators working very hard and had that bill pass the Senate in December. It was the House of Representatives that failed to do its work. They barely even acknowledged that it was an Older Americans Act that needed to be addressed. Yet, as we got very close to the end of the year, there was talk that the House was prepared to accept a version of the Senate bill that had passed. And had that been the case, then they would have been able to put that into the final spending bill that Congress passed as they left. But something broke down at the very last minute. Somewhere that agreement did not happen. And as a result, the bill was not attached to that final bill, and we have to start all over again. So let's go to the next slide and talk about that. So, okay, what could happen with the Older Americans Act? Any number of things, actually. But the role of the new leadership that I talked about earlier will be very important. Senator Cassidy, the chairman of the Health Committee, is now in a very important role. And he also was one of the senators who produced that previous bill last year. And I will say that all of us have been in communication with his office. They are receptive to communication. I'll talk about a letter that we all did shortly. Congressman Walberg, again, we don't have much of a track record with him, but we're happy to say that in our own NANASP organization, we have several members who are in his district, and we've already reached out to make contact with him to establish a relationship. So the question is, are we going to start working from last year's bill or start with a completely new bill? Now, one thing that we keep in the back of our mind is that this whole new Department of Government Efficiency is underway. And one of the things they have said, although not very clearly, they have said that any law that has not been authorized or reauthorized, could be a target to be reduced or eliminated or whatever. That probably is not applicable to the Old Americans Act because it's only been a few months, not even a month, since it was supposed to be authorized. I think they're talking more about laws that are 3 or 4 years old that have not been reauthorized. But we have to watch that very carefully, and we are actively communicating with both the House and the Senate on this. Next slide talks about the letter that we just finished doing with Meals on Wheels America, National Council on Aging, U.S. Aging, and Advancing States. All of us came together and said, we're urging Congress to pass the final bipartisan, bicameral negotiated version of the Older Americans Act that was almost done last year, and said, don't have to go back and start from scratch. You've got a good bill, you've got a bipartisan bill. Let's work and get that to be the bill that's taken up this year. And we look forward to working with those 4 members that we talk about on the screen to work for a win for Congress and to reauthorize the act as quickly. And if there's a link there, should you be interested in seeing the actual letter. And, let me just point out that the bill I'm talking about was a 4-year reauthorization of the Older Americans Act. It was provided up to 18% increase in authorizations for the program. It was going to provide a first ever direct care workforce resource center. It continued some of the flexibility in the nutrition program that came from the pandemic, like grab and go meals and things of that nature. It was a good bill that was bipartisan and had input from virtually every aging organization who participated in the development of this bill. So the basic message is we've got a good bill, we've got a good foundation to work from. Let's get on it and move as quickly as possible. And we're waiting for responses to the letter just went out, as you can see, January 27th. And we'll be sharing what we hear back from the 4 offices as we hear about it. Next slide talks about something else that was in this bill, which was the authority for a White House Conference on Aging to be held in 2025. Now, if it goes forward, it would be the 7th one we've had in United States history and the 3rd of the 21st century. Now, what makes this important to me, and I think maybe to Mary as well, is that, a White House Conference on Aging being held in this time period would build on 2 things that have happened in the past couple of years. One is the work of the Interagency Coordinating Committee, which comes out of the Administration for Community Living. They have developed a strategic plan for a national plan on aging. But I think what's more important are the 37 states that are working on multi-sector or master plans for aging, where in these plans are some really good ideas for how we can have a national policy on aging in the future. So it's been my belief that if we had a White House Conference on Aging, these plans would be at the centerpiece of that agenda. And for those who want to see it happen, and by the way, there's not unanimity among everybody about whether we should have a 2025 White House Conference on Aging or not. But for those who want to see it happen, this is another good reason to work toward a early passage of an Older Americans Act this year. So what else could be on this aging agenda? Well, some of these things are more certain than others. Medicaid reform, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that could be included, such as reducing the federal share under Medicaid to those states that expanded Medicaid as a result of the Affordable Care Act. There could also be work requirements imposed on Medicaid recipients. Okay, the work requirements seems to have a lot of attention and a lot of interest on the part of people in the House and the Senate. Again, it's all about the language. It's all about how you frame it and what you put in there. But I think you can almost be certain that that will be discussed and put in any bill that is aimed to do Medicaid reform. On Medicare reforms, I think there we're talking about, well, one thing that is not going to happen is the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to get repealed. A bill that did a number of things, including allowing first-time negotiation by Medicare for drugs, But the reason it won't get repealed is because starting this year, older adults now have a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs for the first time in history. And what's important about that $2,000 cap is that they also put a provision in that says you can spread the payment out on that over the course of a year. You don't have to pay the $2,000 all at one time. So that, if we're going to have Medicare reform, it's likely to be in the kinds of drugs that are negotiated under Medicare. Okay, the Biden administration chose certain drugs. The Trump people could come back and change the list of drugs that are being negotiated for. But I think fundamentally, the law on negotiation stays and the law on the cap stays. Tax reform, if you look at the last bullet, they're sort of connected. We know there's going to be tax reform. A bunch of tax cuts expire this year, and the president would like to see them renewed. So the question is going to be, are they going to be renewed, and what else can be included in a tax reform bill? Well, certainly one thing that the president himself has called for in the campaign is a family caregiver tax credit. Okay. And Mary knows full well, and I'm still on the board of AARP and the AARP Foundation, and that is one of our top priorities to get done this year. And the question will be, how big a bill will it be when it gets all said and done? And will the bill, the thing we worry about is we love to see the family caregiver tax credit in there, but if the bill includes cuts to aging programs to offset the cost of a tax bill, that's something we don't want to see happen. So this is going to be a real close call as to what happens, what's going to be in that bill, and so on. And that's going to require all of us to pay good attention and weigh in when there is an actual bill to say that you support a family caregiver tax credit, but not at the expense of cutting aging programs. On Social Security, I don't expect a lot of activity. The president did call for ending taxation of Social Security benefits, but I don't see anybody up here really jumping on the bandwagon to get Social Security opened again. Social Security has good stability through the early part of the next decade, and Congress does not normally take things on if they don't have to, and this is not one that has to be taken up. But should the president decide that he wants to push for ending taxation of Social Security benefits, that could be put into a tax bill, but it could also create a lot of issues for the solvency of Social Security. So that's going to be watched very carefully. And then finally, I'll mention the Farm Bill because it isn't just about farmers and ranches and stuff. It's about almost 80% of that bill is about domestic nutrition programs, SNAP, Commodity Supplemental Food Program, senior farmers markets, things of that nature. And it's a very important bill that got stopped last year, and we hope full well to see it get renewed this year in the right way. So next slide. So let's talk about the opportunities and the challenges. And, again, this was written a few days ago. There are probably like 6 more challenges I could have put in here, but let me take them one by one. Finishing the Old Americans Act is an opportunity, and doing so by stressing its value as a program. A great return on investment. Those of you who run Old Americans Act programs know full well what I mean. How well they're run, how much they save Medicare and Medicaid, so on down the road. But we need to start doing more of that, stressing its value. Now, if we have, some of you may not know what MAHA is, that is Make America Healthy Again, which is a proposal of the potential new Secretary of Health and Human Services. Kennedy has talked about MAHA and its importance. To us, the importance of nutrition is a great opportunity there to talk about how nutrition contributes to lowering chronic disease, preventing chronic disease, how nutrition and health belong together. And the potential incoming secretary has talked about food and the kind of food that we should be going forward with. And we see this as a great opportunity to advance nutrition. The opportunity with the family caregiver tax credit I just talked about will be the first time in history. It would be, in my judgment, if this were to pass and pass the right way, it would be an absolute affirmation of the importance of family caregivers from a policy perspective and a political perspective. To get the president in the campaign to call for this was considered remarkable, and to see it get done would even be more remarkable. We also could see an expansion of medical nutrition therapy under Medicare, which is considered very important for helping people to get the right kind of advice and what kind of nutrition to get. We could see more support for home and community-based services if we stress the cost-saving nature of those services, particularly in Medicaid. An opportunity always exists, but now the urgency is even greater on the workforce. We have got to address the workforce shortage we have across the board in this country, and it's particularly in healthcare. We also need to look at how supplemental benefits under Medicare Advantage are going. How are they doing well? Should they be continued? Should they be expanded? We know that one of the most popular ones is nutrition. And then finally, the White House Conference on Aging could be an opportunity as well. Now, challenges, some of which I've talked about. What are we going to do about funding for the rest of the year? Are we going to avoid cuts? And could we even see some increases? Protecting Medicaid, a top issue, okay, particularly in our states, particularly in aging programs, many of whom now get more from Medicaid than they do from the Older Americans Act. And protecting Medicaid is going to be very important. Finishing the Older Americans Act could be a challenge for this reason. If they don't go with the bill from last year and start from scratch, there are already some ideas that are floating around about changes that people would make to the Older Americans Act. One which has come back, surprisingly, is to raise the eligibility age from 60 to 65 in the Older Americans Act, which would be detrimental to a number of things, including the fact that it would disenfranchise older minorities in this country, many of whom don't live as long as non-minorities. And if you start raising ages, their ability to be in a program is cut back. Tax reform and how to pay for it is a challenge. The Government Efficiency Commission and how aging programs fare is a challenge. And of course, the item that I began with, will this pause on federal grants and loans go forward? Will it stop? Will it be modified? But whatever happens, it's a challenge. So let's talk in a positive way about the fact that 2025 is a remarkable year for anniversaries. With Medicare, with Social Security being 90, the Older Americans Act, Medicare and Medicaid being 60, the Affordable Care Act with the Elder Justice Act in it at 15 years of age. These could be spearheads to move things along and get some things done and move progress along. Or it could just be noted as an anniversary. We don't know yet. It's too early to tell. And one other one that I'm personally proud of is that 30 years ago, I had the pleasure of directing the White House Conference on Aging for President Clinton, and a number of North Carolinians that were there. I think Mary might have been there as well, and some other folks. So it's our 30th anniversary of that conference. So let me just close with two quotes that I have seen in recent weeks that I think really capture kind of where we are and where we need to be. One came from former President Obama, who said, "It is not about abandoning your convictions and folding when things get tough. It's about recognizing that in a democracy, power comes from forging alliances and building coalitions. Purity tests are not a recipe for long-term success." And Senator Kane from my state of Virginia says, "Advance where you can and defend where you must." And we'll close with how to find me if you want to email me and ask me any questions, but I think I'll stop here. Thank you, Caitlin, for the marvelous job of moving these slides. And I guess we'll go to Linda for moderating any questions. So thank you all very much.
Caitlin, do you want to moderate those, or do we? I see one question.
I do see one, and it says, sorry, here, feedback. Let's see, there we go. Does SSBG feed HCCBG funding, or are they separate?
Let me look at that question. I think I saw that come in, and I didn't see the second part of it. Where was that? Do SS feed? Okay. I need to know what HCCBG is.
I think that's me, Bob. SSBG primarily goes to our departments of social services and our adult protective services units. However, since we call that a block grant, part of it's federal OAA, part of it is state funding. There is about 0.04% of our HCCBG funds that are SSBG. I
Okay.
looked for the current year, it's about $450,000 out of 12 million.
All
So
right.
it's a very, very tiny piece somehow that they must throw into the block grant. Never seen very much of it. So there's that one, Bob.
That's good to know. Okay, because it varies across the country. There's some states that utilize more money for home delivered meals, and some use more. So that's what block grants are all about. It's a state decision how they spend the money, and so that's good to know. Thank you, Linda, for that. And yes, for all those, yes, the copies of these slides are most certainly available. And for some of you who are avid readers of slides and things, you're the kind of people I'll get questions from later, which is fine by me. So.
So Bob, this is Mary Bethel. I'll just add to that issue about SSBG funding for adult protective services. In North Carolina, as Linda, I think was just saying, it's minuscule the amount of state dollars that go into adult protective services. It is primarily funded by SSBG and county governments. So it's a real issue, and particularly in low wealth counties, about the amount of money they have to support adult protective services. And one of the big voids in that is they don't have money for what we call essential services. Like if they need to put somebody up in a hotel or something like that to remove them from a situation. We just don't have those resources. So that's one of the priorities of this agent advocacy groups this legislative session, is to try to seek some state funding for adult protective services in North Carolina.
Well, as in my role as national coordinator of the Elder Justice Coalition, I'm totally supportive of that. I think more states need to do that. I mean, one of the issues that we're confronting, SSBG has been the primary funding source for adult protective services, but for the first time in history, there is a $15 million item in the ACL budget for formula grants for adult protective services. But you may remember during the pandemic, okay, the Elder Justice Act got $376 million in funding after only getting $100 million for the previous 10 years. And most of that money went to APS to do a number of things to enhance their capacity to help victims and prevent elder abuse. We worked like heck, and there was a Congressman Neal from Massachusetts also did, to try to keep that money going in fiscal year 25. But the problem is we have 15 million that's in the current budget for APS. The Senate would agree to keeping 15 million. The House, their version of the funding bill for next year had no money for APS in that funding formula. So we are adamant about trying to make sure that at least the 15 million, if not more, can be given through ACL to supplement what SSBG provides for APS, because we gotta face facts. Elder abuse is not going away. Elder abuse remains a huge national problem, and the scams alone. And I'll tell you something that's interesting. One of the things that we're going to prioritize is not on my slides, but something we've worked on. Would you believe that today, if you are a scam victim, let's say you were scammed out of $100,000, when you go to pay your taxes, you're going to be taxed on the $100,000 that you lost. Okay, so you get hit twice. You get scammed, and then when your tax bill comes, you're still being taxed as if you had the $100,000. So there's a bill in Congress right now that we're going to try to put on the tax bill that provides relief for victims of disasters and scams, which we think makes common sense, and we hope can get it passed by the Congress this year. I guess.
I have a quick question, Bob.
Ma'am.
There's been a lot of talk that if it wasn't they're not going to fund anything that wasn't authorized. So where does that leave us with OAA?
Well, I think I've looked at some of the language that they've talked about in this commission, and I've seen more than once that they are talking about programs that have gone reauthorized for 3 years or more. Okay, the Older Americans Act is not in that situation. The Older Americans Act has only been out, not reauthorized, for several months. I don't think it is as serious a victim as other programs would be, but it is the reason why that letter went out. That letter went out to say, get it done. You've got the vehicle to do it. You've got the bill from last year to do it. There's really no reason not to get it done quickly. And what I've seen so far in the short time since this letter has been out in the street, so to speak, we've gotten some positive feedback from the staff of these people that we wrote the letter to. particularly Senator Cassidy's office, who's very pivotal to this whole thing. If Cassidy decides that he wants to move, that and really enhances the prospects of the Old Americans Act getting done. The wild card is the new chairman in the House. And that's why we're spending time making introductions, doing relationship building to make sure that he understands the importance of the program. He's from Michigan, which has, both a lot of urban and rural constituencies. He happens to represent a rural area of the state of Michigan. We know how important the Older Americans Act is to the rural older adult. So we're doing all we can to move the process along. And that's why we decided as a group of U.S. Aging, NCOA, NANAS, MOA, and advancing states to write one letter stating that position as clearly as possible to those key people.
All right. I think we're out of questions. You did a great job, Bob.
Well, whether I did or not, I hope people take advantage of sending me a note if they have anything left on their mind. And Mary, you're wonderful for letting me go first. I appreciate it. You're a marvelous leader, and I'm only sorry I can't hear what you have to say, but I know it's going to be brilliant. And I hope I see you sometime this year, and I hope I get down to North Carolina again to see everybody. And Linda, thank you. And Caitlin, of course, thank you for the hard work of putting this together, okay?
Yeah, no
Thanks,
problem.
Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Bob, the only thing I could say is don't ever retire.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you. So you want me to go ahead and
Yeah,
pick up
I'm gonna
here?
turn it over to you, Mary.
All right, great. Well, thank you guys. I'm so pleased to be here today. Bob is a hard act to follow, but I think one theme that certainly came through in what he talked about and what you're hearing, what I've got to say also, is that aging policy is not developed in a vacuum. And all those other things that are going on certainly impacts on whether we're able to get funding, whether we're able to get legislation passed, things of that nature. And just to give you an idea of some of the things that had a big impact in North Carolina, I would say in the last year on the ability to get aging legislation or appropriations done. We've got a lot of things. One is Medicaid expansion. The state had been trying for 10 years to get that done, and that had actually taken a lot of oxygen out of the air in trying to get anything else done. Certainly, it was supported by all aging advocacy groups and all, and we're so glad that it passed. In the first year of Medicaid expansion came into effect, over 600,000 people signed up for that program. And a lot of those were between the ages of 55 and 65 that had a lot of chronic health conditions. So it's really been a godsend to many people in North Carolina. And one of the things that we are currently going to be facing in North Carolina is the fact that when our Medicaid expansion legislation passed, there was a provision put in that if there was a reduction in federal funds, then North Carolina, along with 9 other states, could terminate their Medicaid expansion. So we have a lot at stake on what's going to happen to Medicaid funding as far as whether or not we're going to be able to continue Medicaid expansion. Another thing that's certainly having an impact on policy related to aging in North Carolina is just the sheer growth of our population. North Carolina is now the 9th heaviest populated state in the country, and we're about ready to move up to number 8. And we also have the 9th largest population of people over the age of 65. So that's got a lot of implications about not only current needs, but what future needs are going to be down the track. We also, we're seeing a decrease in state tax rate, and that increase impacts how much money is going to be in the state coffers to fund things. For instance, it is reduced from 4.75% in 2023 to 4.5% in 2024, and it's going to be reduced further down to 3.99% in 2026. Now, with some of the other things going on, like growth in business and things like that, the legislature, I think, is waging that with the increase in businesses and things of that nature, that will offset some of the tax loss, but that remains to be seen. I think also, just to talk about that, is North Carolina is seen as one of the best states in the country to do business. We consistently are in the top 3 of any of these surveys or polls that come out about where companies want to come to do business. One of the big things, though, even though the jobs created, the revenue coming in, the taxes that are paid, and things like that, in many cases, the state does end up paying a lot of incentives, tax incentives, to get these new businesses and all to come in. And unfortunately, a lot of those new businesses and things that come in go to the same areas. They don't go to a lot of our rural areas in many cases, which I think is even contributing further to what we call the rural urban divide. And since policy, particularly at the legislative level, is made by 170 legislators from all over North Carolina, representing all 100 counties in North Carolina, the perceptions of rural legislators is very different from that of urban legislators. And sometimes that can be a challenge in trying to move issues forward. Something else that is really playing into this too is in March of last year, North Carolina legalized sports betting. And I saw the data from 2024 and how much was spent. Over $5 billion was wagered in North Carolina on sports betting in 2024. And that was even with not even a full year of wages. It didn't start until March. We also know that there's a lot of discussion about doing casinos in North Carolina. It did not pass last year, but Virginia's got a couple of new casinos that just opened across the border, and North Carolinians are flocking over there left and right to go wager bets. And that issue is going to come back up again. It does have the full support of a lot of leaders in the General Assembly, so it's got a good chance of passing. I think one of the other things that certainly is impacting our state now is going to have a big impact for years to come is Hurricane Helene, which came, through our state on September 27th of this year. The Office of State Government and Management estimated that it was the damages and the needs that we had as a state equated to $59.6 billion. Now, we certainly hope to get a significant amount of federal funding to help with that. A lot of these discussions going on in DC right now certainly will impact that, but it's going to impact the amount of funds that are going to be available in our state to do other things, including the aging programs and services that we all care dearly about. I think another thing that's going to be a ramification for that is that we have sometimes a lot of private money that's going in, whether it's through foundations or other types of things to fund aging services. I'm already beginning to hear that a lot of these groups are saying that, because of the level of destruction from Helene, we're going to be shifting some of our monies that we might have been spending on other things to Helene recovery. So that could have an impact on what's going on. One of the other things that is having a significant impact on policy in North Carolina is the fact we had a 2024 election in the state, and we've had a change in political leadership. Now, we have maintained a Democratic governor and attorney general, and also a new lieutenant governor who happens to be from the Charlotte area, as well as our attorney general is from the Charlotte area. But our legislature is firmly Republican. So we kind of have split government with people more in our executive branch being Democrats and those in our legislative branch being solidly Republican, which lots of times there's a significant amount of disagreement among those bodies. And I will say the General Assembly did take action in December when they still had a supermajority to limit the powers of the governor of North Carolina more. North Carolina has one of the weakest governors as far as the powers they have of any governor in the state, and one of the strongest state legislatures. So, it makes for interesting dynamics when it comes to try to get legislation passed or appropriations through the General Assembly. One of the things I mentioned about the supermajority, last year, the General Assembly had a supermajority, which means they had three-fifths of the seats in both the North Carolina House and the North Carolina Senate. The significance of that was that they could override governor's vetoes. And there were a lot of bills overridden, governor vetoes overridden last year. So we will see how that plays out this year. Right now, the House is one seat short of having a supermajority. They've got 71 seats that are Republican and 49 seats that are Democrats. The Senate does have a 3/5 majority of 30 Republicans and 20 Democrats, but you've got to have both houses to have that supermajority in order to override a governor's veto. It is interesting that, you know, our elections certainly make national news. We still have the Supreme Court race that has not been settled, and that has ramifications on just how things play out at the state level also. Our state General Assembly happens to be back in session today to really officially start business for the 2025 legislative session. We have already heard from a lot of our leaders in the General Assembly, as well as the governor, that a chief priority is going to be Hurricane Helene recovery, which it certainly needs to be. Whoops. Did we lose something here? Can you guys see me? I can't see y'all now. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. So we know that's going to be taking place. We have a new Speaker of the House who is a 36-year-old from Caldwell County. This is his first time of serving because Representative Moore, who had been the Speaker of the House for the previous 10 years, is now in Congress. And he has basically said that he sees some of his priorities being education improvement and the state health plan and benefits for teachers and state employees, things of that nature, as well as Hurricane Helene recovery. So it's going to be one of these things where you've got agent interests competing with things that have been identified as top priority areas for the state already. We know that some of the things that the state is committed to funding. Last year, an additional $463.5 million was put into the Opportunity Scholarship Program, or the voucher system for educational programs in the state. The General Assembly seems to be committed to continuing that funding. We know that the state health plan for teachers and state employees faces a $5.7 million deficit. We don't know if that's going to be, General Assembly is going to fund anything there or not. And there's some other big ticket items that are really high on the list, such as child care subsidies, things of that nature. And one of the things that the General Assembly does, they agree on what the budget will be up front, and they assign a budget amount to each of their appropriations committees. And the committee that deals with most of the issues that relate to aging is the Appropriations Committee on Health and Human Services. So if there are a lot of needs identified in Health and Human Services that exceed the pot of money that has been allocated for Health and Human Services that leadership has agreed to, they cannot go to another appropriations committee, say transportation or government transportation appropriations committee, and get funds from them unless the General Assembly approves, which they rarely do approve shifting of funds like that. So in the case of Health and Human Services funding, you get aging funding competing with things like mental health, child care, social services, vocational rehabilitation, the regulatory agency that monitors all healthcare facilities, including nursing homes, assisted living. So there are a lot of competing interests for Health and Human Services. And of course, the biggest ticket item in Health and Human Services is going to be Medicaid funding. So that's a really big issue that we need to think about how it's going to be addressed in North Carolina. Something else that's going to impact how things move forward, at least from the department level at Health and Human Services, where aging programs fall under, is the fact with the new governor, he has named a new secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, and that individual is Dr. Dev Sangvaya. And so he's going to have a period of transition coming in, and it remains to be seen, how soon he's going to want to take on new initiatives or activities or things like that. We have already invited the North Carolina Coalition on Aging has already sent a letter to the new governor, Josh Steins, as well as to Secretary of Health and Human Services, Sangvaya. And we have shared the legislative agendas for the coalition, which very closely models what's in the multi-sector plan on aging for North Carolina. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And we also invite the secretary to attend the next Coalition on Aging meeting, which is February 28th. And I received notice yesterday that he is going to be joining us for that meeting. So I think that's a very positive step. We do know that when the last Secretary for Health and Human Services left office, Cody Kinsley, he basically kind of left a lot of instructions and things for the new secretary, telling him priority issues that he thought he needed to pay attention to. And aging was one of the top issues that he said that because of demographics and other issues in the state that we needed to pay, that the department needed to pay attention to aging. So I think that's a very positive thing that's important in North Carolina as far as moving forward. And of course, as Bob has just mentioned, another thing that impacts what's going on in Washington, in North Carolina when it comes to aging policy is what's going on in Washington, D.C. at the federal level. And we've just heard about the developments of the last couple of days and the implications of what's happening there. Just as an FYI, 79% of the budget of the Department of Health and Human Services, their budget's $40 billion, comes from the federal government. So the decisions that are made at the federal government level are greatly going to impact health and human services in North Carolina. If we see a reduction in some of these block grants like SSBG or other types of programs, the state's going to have to make some hard decisions about, are they going to take state appropriations in order to make up those gaps? So with all that being said, it's going to be really challenging to try to get new things on the agenda of the legislature when they're trying to look at how they can maintain existing programs and services. I think one other thing that's not on the list, I think that certainly is going to be a point of discussion among policy leaders in North Carolina about what they're going to do, is the fact that our COVID or ARPA funds are in the process of ending. So is there going to be a effort to continue programs and services that have started with some of that funding, or to make up for gaps that these have helped to cover, or what's going to be the process of doing that, and what does that spell for moving forward with other additional things? So having said all that, I think we probably as a state are in the best position that we've been in a long time, and I've been here a long time, as far as trying to begin to move an aging agenda. And that's because we now have a new multi-sector plan on aging. And here's a copy of it. I hope most of you are aware of this. For the last year, this plan was under development. Our last governor, Roy Cooper, issued an executive order in 2023 that, among other things, called for the development of this multi-sector plan on aging. And basically what this plan is a roadmap for moving forward in North Carolina and how we should address aging issues. Over 250 people in the state came together and worked for months in 4 work groups, and those work groups were supporting older adults and their families, strengthening communities for a lifetime, optimizing health and well-being, and affording aging, to come up with recommendations that they thought of things that they felt strongly of things that need to be done in North Carolina to move the needle on aging issues in our state. They came up with 160 recommendations, as I said, and knowing that it would be impossible in the near future to address all 160 recommendations, there was a lot of scrutiny done, and 41 recommendations were identified to be priorities for action in 2025 and 2026. Now, I've been around a long time, and I started working in aging in North Carolina in the 1970s, so I'm telling my age here. But I know about 25 years ago, when I happened to be at the Division of Aging, we developed a comprehensive plan on aging for North Carolina that we unveiled with great fanfare and shared with the General Assembly and tried to get things done. Now, some good things did come out of that, the Home and Community Care Block Grant being one of them. But a lot of the visionary type things that we really tried to propose in that plan never happened. Bill Lamb, who many of you know, who's kind of an old warhorse like I am in aging, he's been very active in lots of different things. He worked for the Division of Aging. He worked for the Institute of Aging when that was around. And he probably now is devoting most of his energy to being one of the chief leaders for Friends of Residents in long-term care. But Bill was at the division 25 years ago when this plan was developed, and he was kind of the lead architect of it. He was telling me that he was at a meeting at the Division of Aging about a year and a half ago, and they had the door closed to the room they were in, and it started squeaking. So somebody got up and went to a bookshelf and pulled off something to kind of wedge the door so that it wouldn't squeak. And he had the corner of his eye, he saw that it was that plan on aging that was done 25 years ago. So I think it's imperative upon us that we don't let this plan on aging become a doorstop, that it become a proactive document for what we can do to age and live well in North Carolina. And I think the difference now than what it was 25 years ago is the demographics are now driving the show. And I don't need to tell you guys about the demographics, you know them, but I'll just mention two statistics. The 65 plus population is going to grow by 48% between 1922, when we had 1.9 million people, to 1924, when it's projected we're going to have 2.8 million people. At the same time, the 85 plus population that we know, the older are going to be the ones that are going to require the most services and programs. And that segment of the population in that 20-year period of time is going to grow 114%. Now, the thing I think that certainly gets policymakers' attention on this is that with the increased numbers of older people, you've got more people who are going to need services and supports, and particularly things like assisted living and nursing home care. And we know that a lot of people go into facilities as private pays, and some people go in as Medicaid recipients or state county special assistance recipients to start with. But most people spend down all their money and they end up becoming eligible for Medicaid. For instance, right now in North Carolina, over 2/3 of the people on Medicaid in North Carolina, in nursing homes in North Carolina are on Medicaid. So what is that going to look like and the implications for state budget, 20 years down the road when we have such a huge number of older adults going forward? So I want to just talk a little bit about this multi-sector plan on aging and why I think it's a critical tool for helping us to move this needle. It does provide a framework for what we can do. It also is imperative of us that as we try to move this forward, we have a place at the table. I tell people all the time, if you are not at the table, you're going to be on the menu, because everybody out there is trying to get their issues before policymakers. They're trying to get the appropriations. They're trying to get the bills passed. And not only do we need to be at the table, we need to be at the big table, not at the little table. When I was a kid, kids sat in the kitchen at the little table. It was our goal to get at the big table in the dining room. We need to be at the dining room table so that we can have a voice that is heard and be listened to. We also need to be able to articulate clearly what the needs are. And we've got to have facts and figures and all the documentation that will help to help make the case for why we need what we need. We need to be active in looking at the language of bills that need to be introduced. We need to have funding requests, as I said, that are based on sound budget numbers, things of that nature. And we've got to figure out who are the people that can help us to move these issues forward. So who's going to step up and be the champions for aging? We can have champions in the aging community, but we've got to identify champions in the legislative arena, in the executive arena, in the Department of Health and Human Services, all of who can help us to move these issues forward. And I think as advocates, we need to speak with one voice to the extent we can. Now, the nice thing about this multi-sector plan on aging and these 41 recommendations that we identified as priorities for this next 2 years, 14 of those recommendations are things that have been identified that will require legislative action. And I would say that looking at the legislative agendas that the Coalition on Aging, groups like AARP North Carolina, the Senior Tar Heel Legislature, Friends of Residents in Long-Term Care, and others have come up with, people have used this multi-sector plan on aging to the large extent to come up with what their legislative priorities are for this session coming up. So it is, people are trying, I think, to bring a unified voice to the powers to be to try to to be able to get a lot of synergy around what's going on here. Now, I want to tell you about the recommendations for the Coalition on Aging because we've worked really hard to basically kind of mold our recommendations around what a lot of these priorities in the multi-sector plan on aging are. And Caitlin, if you don't mind pulling those up just a minute, I'll share those.
I sure will.
Thank you.
Can you see them?
Not yet, but I think you can double click. There we go.
There we go.
All righty. So the things that we're really going to be working with the legislature on this session that we hope will get traction. Our probably overall priority is going to be is we would like for them to establish a study commission on aging. Now, North Carolina had a study commission from 1987 to 2011. What happens with a study commission on aging? That is a vehicle for studying issues and for ending up making recommendations to the General Assembly as a whole of about what they think is important. Commissions have both legislators as well as citizens at large. They are appointed by the leaders in the General Assembly, and they meet when the General Assembly is not in session. So the earliest that this could be done would be having a commission that hopefully could meet between the 2025 session and 2026 session, if this could happen. The importance of doing this by having a commission, again, is that the legislators who serve on this commission can then be the bill sponsors for things that come out of the commission. So it gives a head start as far as getting traction. They have kind of been vetted by this commission to move forward. So I think we saw a significant amount of legislation passed during that period of time when we had a commission, because you did have that head start and you already had identified champions that would take on issues. Now, we also want to look at a series of recommendations to strengthen programs and services to help address the needs of diverse aging population. The healthcare workforce crisis is a huge issue, as you guys know. It's not only things like nurses and doctors, but it's direct care workers, those people that do the hands-on care. There are a lot of things that are going on in North Carolina already. We want to support those efforts. We want to look at reimbursement under Medicaid to continue to support making sure people that are providing service, particularly direct care workers, get living wages. We also want to look at things like loan repayment programs, tuition reimbursements, stipends to attract healthcare workers, things of that nature. The second area is we want the state to establish a state-facilitated, privately operated retirement savings program. There are a lot of businesses and small employers particularly that do not offer employees the option to say paycheck saving. We know that the best way to get people to save for retirement is to get them to deduct it from their paycheck before it ever goes home with them. This program is called Work and Save. AERP North Carolina is taking the lead on this. It does have bipartisan support and by a lot of folks, and we're hoping this is going to be the year this is going to go through. People are not saving right now, and we know that my parents used to talk about saving for a rainy day. Well, a lot of folks don't have a rainy day fund anymore, and therefore they end up not having the resources to cover healthcare costs and other types of things. We also want to look at funding to enable adults in our state, regardless of where to live, to have access to a continuum of home and community-based services and long-term care services and supports, not only from home care, but to assisted living, to nursing homes, that people, no matter where you live, ought to be able to have the services they need when they need them. Now, this is something that's going to take a lot of getting into. And this is something that we could see being a prime issue that the General Assembly Study Commission on Aging, if they establish one, could take on as a challenge. Is a type of thing, if we don't begin to address now, our options and our recourse is going to be very much minimized from what it's going to be 10 or even 15 years down the track. So, and we know right now that where you live often determines what service you should get at what level and whether you get them at all. So another thing that is a priority is to support people aging in place, particularly looking at what we can do in the area of housing. I've been around this business a long time, and when you talk to older people, used to when I talked to them, they would talk about wanting to stay at home and make sure they had transportation to be able to get around. Now, when you talk to folks, they talk about wanting to stay at home, but housing is a big issue that people bring up. We want to look at things like funding for home repair and modifications. We want to examine things like the homestead property tax exemption program that provides property tax relief for low-income older adults and persons with disabilities. Our program has not really been changed since 2008. They did raise the eligibility level for the program from 20,000 to 25,000 2028, and they did tie that eligibility level to increases in the Social Security cost of living. So it kind of goes up gradually every year. But what we're seeing, particularly in areas that have been gentrified a lot, that people are just being pushed out of the homes because they cannot afford property taxes. And some of our lower wealth counties also, because they have to have fairly high property tax rates just to have enough revenue to operate. It's also an issue in some of those counties too. We also want to examine things like low interest loans and tax credits and things like that that might encourage more housing development and renovation. We'll look at efforts to foster a culture of healthy living in the state, looking at things like supporting senior centers, as well as health promotion programs such as North Carolina Senior Games, things of that nature. And then we have a list of recommendations that we would like to see support family caregivers. Things will help to reduce the caregiver burden, like Project Care, which is the caregiver alternative running on empty that provides respite care for caregivers. Look at family leave policies and provisions. North Carolina currently does not have a state policy on family and paid leave. And also, Bob mentioned that there's talks at the federal level about doing a tax credit for family caregivers. We also would like to broach the issue about a state tax credit for family caregivers with our North Carolina General Assembly. And then our last area is to protect vulnerable older adults and persons with disabilities. Our adult protective service funding in North Carolina is not adequate. Our counties are struggling to do what needs to be done. And therefore, you get a lot of not uniformity across the state in what is done with adult protective services. We had the first adult protective service law in the country that was passed in 1975. Unfortunately, our law has not been revised since that time. We also need to look at more funding for county departments of social services. And as we heard already, a lot of our funding, line share of it comes from the social services block grant. If that would happen to be cut, that have devastating impact on adult protective services in North Carolina. We desperately need funds to fund emergency services and other things that agencies need just to provide critical services when they're dealing with folks who have these needs. And the last issue is to rebase the state county special assistance rate, which is the rate that is paid for room and board for low-income individuals to be in assisted living in North Carolina. Our rate for assisted living has not changed since 2008. So we would basically, for a long period of time, without having that rate changed. It did, effective with January of 2022. It was increased based on the cost of living adjustment for Social Security, and will be increased that amount every year. But to make up for those 12 years of not having a rate increase is very difficult. And I understand, particularly in Mecklenburg County, I've heard this from some of the ombudsmen, that you hardly have any facilities now in Mecklenburg that will take state county special assistance because it is not enough to cover basic room and board. So that is a really, really big issue. So in closing, just a few comments. It's really important that all of us in the state, whether it was state level, regional level, local level, that we be advocates for action, educate all of ourselves about the issues, and decide what are the types of things that we can do as individuals or collectively as groups to help to move things forward. And one of the biggest things that we can do is tell stories and put a face on the issue. So we need those stories. We need, what's the impact of these programs? What's the impact of people not getting services? But, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I will say that for too long, other arenas have been a squeakier wheel that aging has. And we've got to change that. And therefore, we need the involvement and engagement of everybody in this arena. So I sent to Caitlin and others, a list of things like advocacy strategies and techniques, importance for communicating with elected officials, things of that nature. I hope that those will be helpful to you if you, as you venture out in your advocacy work. Bob finished with a quote, and I have one that I like. It's by Margaret Mead, it's an anthropologist. She says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever can." So hopefully we can use our individual voices and we can join with others so that we can make changes. I will also say that aging advocates groups are going to join forces and that we are going to have an aging advocacy day in Raleigh at the General Assembly. We have not settled on the date yet because we're still in discussions with legislators about when they think is the best time to do this, depending on when some of these bills might be introduced that we're talking about getting done. But we will certainly keep you posted on all this and hope that you will hopefully be engaged and involved in this process as we go through. But thanks a lot. Be glad to take any questions if anybody has any at this point.
Thank you, Mary. And everybody, I will be sharing those resources with you that Mary was talking about. She sent a lot of great stuff, so I'll send that your way after we finish up today. But if, like she said, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat box and we can get those answered. I'm seeing lots of hand claps, Mary. Lots of thank yous.
Yeah, I think the big thing is it is challenging times, as Bob said, but I think there's certainly things that we can do, and don't panic. Let's educate ourselves. Let's think about a systematic approach to things. And I think that the advocacy groups in the state kind of have a plan for how we want to move forward on things, and it's going to require the engagement of everybody to be active in this process. And we've got to make our voices heard, and we've got to tell our stories. And the most effective advocates are people at the local level when it comes to the General Assembly, because legislators listen to their constituents, and you are constituents of each of the 170 of our elected officials.
Oh, let's see. I think I see a question. It says, "Thank you for your advocacy. I think waiting lists for nutrition, in-home services, adult care, daycare, etc., speak volumes about the true needs. Is there any effort for the state to compile waiting lists from the counties to calculate the needs in our state?"
That has been the $6 million question for years. I will say, when I talk with legislators, the first question they ask me, how many people are waiting for services? And I think a problem we have is that everybody's definition of what a waiting list is different. And some people don't even put people on waiting lists if they know it's going to be a long time before they have any more availability for services. So I would encourage Linda and others that are in positions of talking with the state to encourage the development of criteria that can be uniform across the board that people can utilize, because truly that is the number one question that we get asked all the time. And we can hedge and we can say, well, we know that we hear that this county's got thousands of people, and then somebody says, well, my county tells me, there was an article not long ago that says we aren't aware of any people waiting for services in our county. And that just kills us, when that happens. So we need to think about that as being a priority, in my view, of something that needs to rise to the surface. That's one of those data, statistics, and points that can really help us to do things.
No more questions from anybody?
Thank you so much, Mary. That's incredibly helpful. We're all excited, and what's coming forward, and what we need to do. Bob and Mary were talking, everyone, before Caitlin opened, and a lot of what they both preach, and they're a longtime advocate, is just be patient. Just be patient. There's things you can do those, but don't panic. Don't, yet. Let's just work together and see what we can do, to make sure that all the right things happen.
And I would say we do have a lot of new people in North Carolina in Congress. And we've got some people that have been there for a while that are certainly big advocates. Senator Tillis, certainly, who's from your area, is in leadership and a lot of things related to aging, and is a big advocate aging issues. Call him, tell him about the impact, what it would mean if and not only him, but everybody, all your elected officials, tell them what the impact would be if services were cut or if services were eliminated. It's that putting that face on the issue, and it needs to come not only for those of us, or I'm not, the people that are being paid, I'm not being paid, people that are being paid to it's their job to do it, but also people that are receiving the services and the families that are providing the services. That's where it makes the difference. And if they get enough calls, then it's going to get attention. I mean, when you call elected officials, you might think your voice doesn't make a difference, but they keep a tally of all the contacts they get from folks. And if they start getting a significant number of tallies or marks about something that they're called on, it does get their attention.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. I'll share everything with you. And I know if you have any questions for Mary or Bob, you can probably send them their way too. But thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye-bye.